Hi, welcome to Mayfair. I am Miley Blocks and we are here at Vicky's Fabrics. If you've done Block of the Months with us before, you can go ahead and skip this unless you want a quick review. This is your Bible. These two things you want to keep very, very carefully, and it has the color key for which patterns are in your black and white copy sheets. And I'm going to show you a little trick for that in just a second. So this is your Bible. You don't want to lose it. On this, you have the front piece, which is your 108-inch square. On the back side, you have the queen size. And really, the difference between the king and the queen is you only have two borders on the top and the bottom, not the sides. But you want to look carefully on the back. In the queen version, you see the appliqued flowers versus the flying geese in this section. I think about month 5 or month 6, you get to choose which one you want to do. We will be doing videos on both how to do applique and how to do the flying geese. When you get your first blocks and your first fabrics, what you might want to do is cut little pieces of your fabric and tape them to the color key. Okay, I'm using Scotch tape, removable, very gentle. Okay, and what people do when they get their pattern, they will take their fabric 1 swatch and lay it onto their pattern. This is fabric 8. They'll take their fabric 8 swatch and lay it onto their pattern, so that when they get to this cutting instruction, they know exactly which fabric they're looking for. When you're done, you can go ahead and take these, stick them back onto your color palette, and then so the next month you can go ahead and continue to add until you have all little fabric swatches for your key here, your color key. Tools. In my videos, you're going to see me use 3 different rulers. The first is the Creative Grid 6.5 by 12.5 ruler. I love this ruler because it has this middle mark that is 3.25 by 3.25. You are going to be doing a lot of 3.25 by 3.25 cuts. I also use this as a landmark when I am cutting 3 1/8 and 3 3/8, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a second. My second tool that I use all the time, Creative Grid Square on Square 8-inch trim tool. You will see us doing a lot of square into squares, and you will see me use the 2.5-inch and the 4.5-inch trim sections. This ruler makes it very, very easy to square blocks from the center, which you'll see me do and hear me say on a regular basis. I also use this to help square my flying geese. Third ruler is the 2 peaks in 1 ruler. It is to make a triangle in a square, half square triangle. The half square triangle, no, I'm sorry, half square rectangle. Half square rectangle, triangle in a square or half square rectangle. I use this all the time. If you ever want to do a Storm at Sea quilt, this is a ruler that you need. A Tri-Rex ruler does the same thing. I do have all these rulers available online in the Block of the Month section on our website. And not only that, the Creative Grid 6.5 by 12.5, I have a left-hander's version as well. We're going to go through 3 different blocks that you are going to see on your general instructions. That's another sheet that's in there. We're going to go through the half square triangle, the square in a square, and then go back to flying geese. You're going to take 2 fabrics, cut the same size. You're going to mark the middle. I usually use a hair marker. You can use a chalk or a pencil, whatever you want to use. And then you're going to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of that line that you've marked. I'm going to lay my ruler on there and I'm going to trim the 2 pieces apart. Okay, so each set of 3.25 by 3.25 squares yields 2 half square triangles. The way we trim them down, if I'm using a regular ruler, I'm going to line up a 45-degree angle right on that line, which is another reason I like this ruler, because they have a 45-degree angle going right into the corner. And I'm going to trim, flip my ruler, and line it up into the 2.5 by 2.5 space and trim again. Okay. Now I can also do that with this ruler, and one of the reasons why I love this ruler is I have no other fussy lines to look at. I just have my trim for the 2.5 by 2.5. I line that up with the center and the diagonal trim, because that white line is my 2.5 by 2.5. You're going to be making a whole bunch of half square triangles and trimming them up. The next piece we're going to do is the square in a square. We're going to be cutting a piece that is 3 3/8. When I have my ruler, I know I'm going to be cutting a piece that's 3 3/8 for the center of my square. I'm going to start with my ruler lining up on the 3 1/4, and then because I know 3 3/8 is bigger than 3 1/4, I'm going to slide it so that my piece is bigger. And I'm saying bigger because if I'm right-handed, I'm sliding to the right. If I am left-handed, it's going to be on this side, I will be sliding to the left. Start with my 3 3/4. I'm going bigger, so I'm going to slide it so that my fabric piece is bigger on the 1/8. And then I'm going to make my first trim before cutting, lining up with my 3 1/4, sliding to my fabric is bigger, to make my second trim to cut that 3 3/8 square, because that's my center. The more accurate this 3 3/8 inch square is, the more accurate your square in a square will be. The other pieces are going to be 3 1/4 inch squares that are then cut in half into triangles. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my square and I'm going to fold it to mark the center of my square. Okay. And then I'm going to fold my triangles to mark the center of my triangles. I'm going to lay that piece right along the edge and on top of the center before opening it up, lining it up. There should be excess room on the top and the bottom, and then I'm going to sew my seam. If you're wondering what this little flappy thing is, this is called a thread mouse. I just slip this under my foot. I take a few stitches on this. Once it is past that, I can slip this underneath and continue to sew, and it pulls this right through without getting that tip mangled. So once you have sewn your triangles on either side, you're going to press these out. You're going to fold this in half again, and then you're going to sew triangles on the opposite sides. Okay, so you're going to have these very fun square in a square units. Now I'm going to show you how we use a regular ruler to trim these out. So we're going to start with our regular ruler. We're going to be wanting to trim these to 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Again, I like this ruler because it has diagonals in there. I also like this ruler because it has a black dotted line at the 1/4 inch. You're going to be using this 1/4 inch here, and you're going to be using this 45-degree angle. I'm going to place this so that there is a 1/4 inch seam here, there is a 1/4 inch seam here. And because this ruler is like magic and it's set up this way, there is a 45-degree angle line from the corner of the 6.5 inch space, and it goes right along that straight edge of the inner square. So I want to be a 1/4 inch here, a 1/4 inch here, and that line parallel. And then I'm going to do my first trim. Then I'm going to flip this around. I'm going to line this up again. Now I'm going to want to put this into my 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch. I want to make sure I have at least a 1/4 inch, so we might need to make some minute adjustments. And then I'm going to trim again. So as long as we are very, very close to that 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch, that we have 1/4 inch seam allowances, when we sew onto the sides, we aren't going to lose these corners. If it takes a little bite into the corner, it's not going to matter. Now I'm going to show you how to square with your Creative Grids tool. This is your 4.5 inch trim. You have dotted lines on the horizontal and the vertical, but they stop short of the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So when I drop this ruler onto my square, I want those horizontal and vertical black dotted lines to be right inside of my square. When I look at this, I notice that this is a tad, I mean, we're talking about less than a 32nd of an inch inside the edge, which is fine. I'm just going to trim it up anyway. If you feel like you want to, this indicates to me that I can take a little bit of a bigger seam allowance bite to make this actually work in the square. This is actually one of the really amazing ways you can check your seam allowance. If your square is much tinier inside the 1/4 inch marks, you've either taken too big a seam allowance or this middle square is too small. If it's way out here, your middle square is too big, or you need to take a bigger seam allowance. And I'm going to trim that up to 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch just using my tool. Okay, so that's the square and the square, the half square triangle, and now we're going to go to flying geese. We're going to have a little ruler lesson again, because flying geese is done with 2 different pieces. The first piece is a 5.5 inch square that we're going to cut on the diagonals. The second pieces, which make the tops of the geese, are going to be 3 1/8 inch squares that we cut in half. Again, when I'm doing this, I'm going to start by finding my 3 1/4. 3 1/8 is less than 3 1/4, so I'm going to slide it to my fabric is smaller. So in this case, it's to the left because I have a right-handed ruler. And that's when I'm going to cut my 3 1/8. I'm going to start here in my 3 1/4. Make sure that's on a straight line. Slide it to my fabric is smaller. And that's how I get a good regular 3 1/8 inch square. So I'm going to take these and I'm going to cut those in half. Those are the smaller triangles of my flying geese. Now, when you are cutting this piece in half or into quarters, what you're doing basically is cutting on the diagonals. So you're going to cut on the diagonal here. You're going to carefully lift, go from square to square, and cut here. The goal is to make sure that these are good 90-degree corners. When you sew your sides onto your goose, you're going to start by lining up your bottom. You're going to sew a seam, and then you're going to press your goose so that the bottom triangle isn't folded. So your first seam, press to the large goose, and then you're going to sew your second goose on, and then you're going to press to the out. So I call that chasing your seams. So your seams on the back side are going to go to the same direction. So I'm going to sew up a couple of these geese, and then we'll come back to trim. We've got our flying geese. I sewed that, press to one side, sew that, press to the other side, and so you see how my seams chase each other. They're going in the same direction, so I've got a pink seam, a light pink seam on top, and then a dark pink seam on top. And this may seem really silly, and it took Tony and Jenny, who designed this pattern from Wing and a Pro Designs, 2 years to convince me to do my flying geese this way. But this is the only way I do flying geese now, because if you do this consistently, with the right side first, the left side, and chase your seams, when you do things like sew flying geese together, the seams here butt. If you sew flying geese top to top, the seams are opposite, so they lie flatter. The first thing I'm going to do is show you how to use your regular ruler to trim flying geese. Again, these are all oversized, so we're trimming these to 4.5 by 2.5. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the diagonal from the corner of my ruler in along this seam, and I'm going to go up to 2.25, and I'm going to find where that 2.25 line meets that diagonal, and that's the tip of my triangle. So if you do not have a diagonal on your ruler, you can go ahead and take a piece of Scotch tape. Do this all the time. Like if you notice, this doesn't have a diagonal on this side, and you know, very carefully use that Scotch tape to give yourself a diagonal line on a regular basis. But again, this is why I love this ruler. I've got a diagonal line. I want 2.25 to be on that tip, so that when I turn it over and I drop it into the 4.5 by 2.5, I know that I'm going to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance from the top of the flying geese to the top of my piece. So when I sew, that's my seam allowance, and I'm not going to lose the point there. If you have the square and a square trim tool, and this is why I love this, I start with the point towards me. I'm going to put that picot, that center point on the ruler, onto the tip of that triangle. I'm going to line up the seams along the diagonals, and that's my first cut. It's one of the reasons why I love this ruler. I don't have to find any measurements. I don't have to find where's my 2.25 every time. I just use the diagonals and the center as my mark point. I trim, and then I take these and I drop it into this ruler, 4.5 by 2.5, and I know that I have that 1/4 inch seam allowance on the trim there. Okay, so these are the major components that we are going to be using to do the Mayfair quilt. You can come back to this video anytime you need a review of the half square triangle, the square and a square, or the flying geese. And we'll see you soon.